I'm James Franklin, and I'm in.
Jason Cabinda, and I'm in.
I am Brandon Bell, and I'm in.
I'm Trace McSorley.
Liz Burnt.
Grant Anderson, and I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm Grant Haley, and I'm in.
Edwin Ruiz.
Shelbie Prater.
Sam Wheeler.
And I'm in.
And I'm in.
And I'm in.
Are you in?
Hi everyone, welcome to the first ever Movement for the Movement event. My name is Keith Oliphant and I am the founder of this initiative.
And my name is Shelbie Prater. I am one of the coordinators for the event.
And we are so glad you all could join us today. We're going to kick off this event with a thoughtful discussion around what this movement is and how allies can join us in the fight for racial equality and justice. Talking a little bit about the history and highlighting the reality of systemic racism, we have with us here today Dr. Whitney Gaskins, Assistant Dean of Inclusive Community Engagement at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Nevin Hurd, Assistant Professor of Clinical Counseling at Roosevelt University. James Franklin, Head Football Coach at Penn State University.
And then as we shift to more action-oriented advice, we'll get to hear from Sean Price, the Program Manager at Youth Guidance here in Chicago. And last but certainly not least, Jason Cabinda, the linebacker for the Detroit Lions. Before we jump in here, I just want to preface this conversation by saying the topic of systemic racism is not one that we can truly flesh out in the course of an hour. To know that our intentions here are really to introduce the concept of systemic racism and provide some guidance around how you can learn more and get involved in this fight for justice and equality for the Black community. All right? And so kicking it off, just being sensitive that we have listeners joining from all different points in their ally journey with all different levels of understanding. We'll start with some more foundational concepts and then we'll kind of move on from there. So kicking it off to Dr. Gaskins, you are a leader in the community in every way possible, from University of Cincinnati's College of Engineering to the local Democratic Party, the founder of your own foundation. So can you talk to us a bit more about the history of racism in America? Kind of where does this come from and what ties us together as a Black community?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you about systemic racism, what it actually means, and just have a great, healthy discussion about it. So systemic racism is more of a process. It's like a process of white supremacy, and that process permeates the fabric of society today. What I mean by that is our educational system is set up in a very unequal way. If you even look at how tax and wealth distribution is handled, we know that money doesn't go to the school systems, usually in the inner city, the same way that you see the distribution of wealth in suburban areas. It is from the fact that we, as Black people, couldn't even buy homes in some areas to get loans. It's called redlining. That in itself impacted generational wealth that held back Black people from passing on something to other generations. There are people that I live next to in my neighborhood who had $50,000 to $100,000 given to them by their parents to put a down payment on their home. We don't have that type of generational wealth in the Black community because of the very processes that were legal and put in place to keep loans and Black people out from buying certain properties. Those are just small examples, but it's in every system that we have here. That's why when we talk about Black Lives Matter, a lot of people want to say, well, all lives matter. I don't disagree that all lives matter, but you can't say all lives matter if you don't address the fact that when we talk about we all were created equal and what we say we believe in the United States and the Constitution cannot be true if we do not love Black people in the same way that we do others.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like you said, we can't say that all lives matter if we don't address the specific issues that plague the Black community in America.
Correct.
That's very insightful. Dr. Hurd, you actually research the realities of racial minorities in America. Can you elaborate a bit more about kind of how systemic racism has been brought to life in our daily lives? You might be on mute, Dr. Hurd.
Gosh, such a rookie mistake. Thank you, Shelbie. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for that question, and I appreciate Dr. Gaskins bringing up redlining as a specific example. When we think of historical and current systems of racism that impact Black folks today, redlining is a great example of a historical practice. So, as Dr. Gaskins said, redlining was an arbitrary practice that denied or limit financial funds to specific neighborhoods, which in practice ultimately denied Black folks opportunities to purchase homes and oftentimes segregated communities of color. That practice has current impacts when we look at things like social determinants of health. Basically are a varying set of conditions that affect a large range of health risks, those conditions being of a social nature. So some of those social determinants of health include what environment and community people are living in, housing and access to that housing, and then also access to health services. So particularly when we think and see how redlining, the impacts of redlining today, they continue to impact Black folks in the form of environmental racism. So oftentimes companies are willing and put those kind of pollution plants in communities of color. We see it come out through gentrification, which is oftentimes slated as this urban revitalization process, but really it displaces Black folks away from their resources and communities that they really worked hard to develop. And then also health deserts. So we think of like health deserts and food deserts and the lack of those kind of resources being in those communities. Those are just some examples of social determinants of health, and one specific example of an historical practice that has impacts today. But there are plenty examples of current systems of racism. One we see early on, Dr. Gaskins mentioned the education system. So one of these current systems of racism we see is the school to prison pipeline. So the school to prison pipeline, basically, it's this concept and idea that education systems disproportionately punish and give harsher punishment sentences to Black students to their white counterparts. And these punishments oftentimes takes Black students out of school and places them into juvenile correction systems and connects them in those ways. So the very real systems of racism also help to uphold people's more personal racist ideas and implicit and explicit prejudice and stereotypes. Oftentimes it's hard for people and allies to gauge, okay, well, this is a system, so what kind of effect am I having? And so that usually is the personal racist ideas or prejudices that can be implicit in stereotypes that people hold. And we have to confront racism on all fronts, on a systemic level as well as an individual level, because these stereotypes can be very limiting and harmful. And just a final thought on this: it's important to remember that Black people, we aren't a monolith, and that the realities of Black people live at the intersection of our other identities, such as sexual orientation, ability, status, and so on. And so we have to be willing to not only deconstruct racism and confront it, but affect these other systems that hurt our most vulnerable of people.
Absolutely.
So Nevin, you talked about, the school to prison pipeline, right? Can you talk about how that connects to the expectations of Black people and how that ties to code switching?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that as well, Keith. So when we think of code switching, right, when we think of code switching or professionalism, those were ideals that were basically created around a white norm. So, for example, and this just came up, I think, in legislature, I want to say in Texas or Florida, where they basically ruled and said that dreadlocks were unprofessional and that they could still kick students out because that is seen as unprofessional. And this is something, right, that is natural for Black folks, is a Black folks' natural hairstyle. So in many ways, Black people are asked to conform to this white norm. And similarly, Black folks engage in a technique that is oftentimes about survival so that they can keep their job, keep their space, and hopefully gain promotion. That's called code switching, which is basically making sure that they're talking in a more proper voice rather than their maybe more normal colloquial voice, as well as trying to dress and perform a certain way so that really that their Blackness isn't punished as it oftentimes is in these societies, in a white supremacist society. And so that other point you brought up about stereotype threat. So Black people are very, at even an early age, are very aware of the stereotypes that are against Black people, as if some stereotypes is Black people didn't really get there on their own, and they got somewhere because of practices that were trying to increase diversity, and that not on their own merit, and Black people aren't as intelligent. And so stereotype threat is this concept that because they carry this knowledge, that stresses them out. So they're less likely to perform well on standardized testing or other tests, because they're oftentimes also may be seen as the token within certain spaces. And that ultimately harms Black people's performance.
I want to add to that point too, is that when he says a young age, it's literally seen within 5-year-olds. So think about a kindergarten kid is already aware of the fact that they are Black and that someone doesn't think they belong. Kindergarten. And so that's how pervasive this problem is, because it's the very minute they enter a school system, they're already aware that they're viewed as an other. And that is very harmful to kids, not just in the educational system, but how they navigate life.
Right.
Right.
Sean, I think Sean's trying to say something but is muted.
My apologies. Again, rookie mistake on my end. Again, if I could just piggyback on something that Dr. Hurd stated, just the fact that there has to be conversation, there has to be policies and discussions passed on the way in which our hair grows and how our hair looks. And the fact that we have curly hair is inherently considered unprofessional. You can't attend school because of that. That speaks to the systemic racism that has been put in place, and how we as African Americans and people of color, we have to continuously try to assimilate into the dominant culture. And so that's a piece that I just didn't want to let go. Just the fact that you have a situation where your hair, just how it naturally grows, is considered unprofessional or unkempt. And subsequently, we have to put in policies and protocols and procedures in order for us to wear our hair naturally.
Right.
And
just
Nevin,
let that sit there for a minute.
And just bouncing off Dr. Hurd, you talked about, how much stress this might bring to an individual, right? Could you talk a little bit more about, it's already hard being a Black person in America. Can you give me a little insight on how hard it must be for females?
Yeah, absolutely. And I welcome Dr. Gaskins I invite Dr. Gaskins to share as well. But so one thing that we bring up or that is very necessary, a part of these conversations, is intersectionality. And so that basically means, so when we think of intersectionality, that basically means that all the identities that we have come together and they intersect to create our total experience. So thus, the more marginalized experiences or identities that we have, the more that we are susceptible to experiencing things like racism, sexism, homophobia, heteronormativity, transphobia, and stigma and prejudice against able-bodied statuses and so on. And so particularly, right, especially when we think of things like the Black Lives Matter movement. This was a movement that was started by 3 queer Black women that was really started to really give voice to the idea that all Black lives. The only time we should be saying all in this conversation is when we're saying all Black lives matter. So those are incarcerated lives, those are trans folks, and those are varying folks that are at the intersection of a Black identity and another identity. We particularly, I'm in the College of Education, and so we see a lot of disparities when we look at just Black folks, but especially when we look at the intersection of Black identities and womanhood. And so those come across as different, a greater disproportional rate when it comes to punishments in schools. And we also see this in kind of different health categories as social determinants of health. So when it is really sad that America, right, we live in what we proclaimed one of the greatest issues of the world, where Black women, when we talk about Black women and maternity rates and pregnancy, are some of the lowest survival rates in any country. And so this often is because that Black women aren't listened to, their voices aren't heard, and as much as they may speak up, they've been neglected. And so that's one thing that I really appreciate about the Black Lives Matter movement and what separates it from movements and civil rights movements in the past. So, for example, with the civil rights movement, there was a lot of respectability politics that came into play, and that was kind of, I won't say shutting the voices away, but kind of saying, well, let's prioritize in certain ways, where this has really been a movement that has been led by Black women, that we can hopefully really see all Black lives matter. But we still see a difference when we think of gender, and maybe not a lot of people know who Atiana Jefferson is or Chandra Bland is, but we know who Mike Brown is or Trayvon Martin is. And so we might see this currently as we were real loud for George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor has still yet to receive justice in a way that's acceptable. And so that's just my thoughts. I hate to be on here when we have a very capable, right, Black woman who's in this work, and I default to her.
Please, well, Dr. Hurd, I think that what you said was perfect. It absolutely highlighted the intersectionality piece that we see as a Black woman navigating the world. And there's so many intersecting identities. I think a lot of the times we want issues to be black and white, but the reality is the world is lived in the gray. And so you can't actually say something is one or the other. And that intersectionality, that complexity, it really does, it can be harmful. I think this is like a perfect time to introduce the notion of privilege in general, because every identity has a little bit of privilege. There's privilege of being male. And so although maybe being Black, that male privilege also shields you from something that it can't shield a Black woman from. And there are privilege different types of identity. There's Christian privilege. There is cis privilege. There's lots of privilege in the world, and understanding how to use it to actually help someone else is a point where we would love our allies to be. And that's how we can help as a nation coming together, using our privilege to help one another dismantle some of those things. One point that I will say for Black women that always troubles me, that I'm just going to take a moment to talk about, is that we have the stereotype, and Dr. Hurd talked about stereotypes, of being strong. And because we have the stereotype of being strong, the stereotypes, I should preface, come from places that are sometimes true, not always true, but there's a reason why it's a stereotype. Black women have overcome quite a few things in spite of, right? So they're still navigating the world, even if the world isn't always supporting them. And so the stereotype of strong isn't necessarily wrong, but it becomes harmful for if I do go to a doctor and I tell you I'm in pain. For some reason, people think that Black women can endure pain that others cannot because we have a stereotype of strong. We don't get prescribed the medication that we need. We're not given the chances, even when we do vocalize, because we have that stereotype. That's just one example of how that intersectionality is problematic and how stereotypes also come into play. Those stereotypes are held up by individuals. So when you don't check your bias of why you think something of a person, or where is that coming from? Why do I not believe this person when they say something? You're holding up stereotypes, which with your implicit or sometimes explicit bias, and it can be harmful to a whole group of people.
Right, absolutely. And, you know, speaking of stereotypes, and you all mentioned, I think, several key points of this conversation, the fact that people will uphold stereotypes, not just of Black women, but of Black people in general, especially when it comes to intersectionality. You talked about how this will begin as early as the kindergarten age of 5 years old, where at that point we realize I'm Black and that means something different in the classroom. Coach Franklin, you deal or have been able to interact with athletes from all different backgrounds throughout your career. Can you speak a little bit about how stereotypes and perception of Black men and Black people and athletes in particular have kind of integrated into your coaching and mentoring style?
Yeah, so first of all, appreciate the opportunity to be on with everybody today. I'll lead with this. Think about this. There's 133 Division I football programs, and there's only 14 coaches of color in 133. So it's pretty telling, right from the beginning. But for me, when I think about it, I think about, I have this title as coach, but really I see myself as a teacher and as an educator. And don't get me wrong, at a place like Penn State, I understand that winning is important. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying, but I'm a huge believer, that I'm using the game of football. We're using the game of football to teach life habits, to teach championship habits that are going to allow our student athletes to go on and be successful in so many different areas of their life. But I also have a responsibility with this. When we talk about systemic racism, very few of our student athletes and very few of our students on college campuses, I think, really even understand what that is. So I have a responsibility to have these conversations. So for me, my job starts and ends with educating. And my job starts and ends with being willing to have uncomfortable conversations. I will say we've had some powerful conversations as an organization right now. And I think really in some ways, I know I'm biased, but in some ways I think coaches have a tremendous opportunity to do that. And we're talking about everything, whether it's racial injustice, whether it's women's rights, whether it's healthy relationships, whether it's social media, whether it's drug and alcohol abuse, whatever it may be. We need to be discussing this. But obviously right now we have a tremendous opportunity to talk about what's going on in our country. And I feel like, at the end of the day, deep down, I have a tremendous responsibility to inform and teach my students and student athletes, how to navigate this world as young men. But it's challenging. There's no doubt about it, but I'm really proud of the things that we're doing specifically at Penn State. I don't work for Netflix, and I don't want to come off like I'm making a plug for them. But I think one of the more powerful things that we have done is watching the Netflix documentary, The 13th. If you haven't seen that, I challenge everybody on this call today to watch it. One of the things that I did, we have 31 sports at Penn State. I'm the only head coach of color, again, of the 31 sports at Penn State. So I challenged the entire athletic administration as well as all the other head coaches to watch it. And it was amazing, the feedback that I was able to get from all the other head coaches as well as the administration, things that a large group of educated people had no understanding and background. And I do think that documentary did a tremendous job of talking about these issues in a way that I think people could receive them. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be on with you guys today.
Absolutely. Coach, you talked about helping your players navigate life in America as young Black men. Is there anything in particular that you kind of coach them to do, to say, not to do, not to say, as they're, playing for you?
Well, I think that the hard thing is, and a lot of this was already spoke on, the reality is we have to be aware of the society and the communities that we live in. And I hope we can get to a point where that we can just truly stay true to who we are. But right now, that's not the world we live in. And, we talk about, understanding that there's a place and time for everything. And the way I talk to my friends is very different than the way I talk to my athletic director and the president of the university. And I think as people of color, and specifically as Black men, you have to understand how to navigate this world. And I wish we were at a point that was not the case, and that everybody, no matter what your background is or what your perspective was, you could just stay true to who you are, but we all have to navigate. And that's what we talk about. How can you come to Penn State and be successful? How can you come to Penn State, be successful there, and leave and go on and do wonderful things? That's why, like Jason Cabinda, who's on this call, I am so proud of Jason Cabinda and all the young men that come out of our program, because I do think they're equipped to go out and be successful. So, I hope that comes off the right way. But the reality is, we'd love to get to a point where no matter what your background is, that you can stay true to that and not be guarded. But the reality is that's not where we're at. So I think I have a responsibility to teach my players and the people in my program that this is what is necessary to be successful at this time. But that doesn't mean we're not willing to have conversations and try to make things better for our children. I have 2 daughters. My wife is half Nigerian. So we have 2 daughters, and I want to make sure that I leave State College and Penn State and our country and our world better one day. And that's by by being able to have conversations like this.
I want to just highlight one of the statistics that you shared. You said there were 14 coaches of color. And I think that that's just another example of the systemic racism that we see in the country. We can always quantify certain things which really do highlight the problem. But it's interesting because overwhelmingly in sports programs, they're dominated by Black men, but yet they're not seen as people who can lead. And I find that to be another one of those stereotypes, that we're okay using Black bodies for whatever might further entertainment or a cause, but never to lead a group. I just wanted to highlight that.
Well, if I could add one more thing there that is interesting, and Jason, who's on this call, knows, is something I get somewhat, I try not to, but I get somewhat defensive about. Even the Black coaches that we do have in college football, we are viewed and we are presented as the recruiter. The Black coach is the recruiter. The Black NFL coach is the player's coach. So it's never about our ability to be a CEO and make decisions and be viewed, as a cerebral, intelligent person that manages a very complex organization. They want to put us in the category of the recruiter or the player's coach. So I think those stigmas, are powerful, and I try to make sure that we address them as much as we possibly can to change those stigmas. No different than it used to be with the Black quarterback.
And one thing Coach said, there's one thing Coach said, when he talks about being, equipped for life. And I think about this when I think about a lot of the teammates, a lot of the guys that I've come across, that have came from different backgrounds, or have came from the hood. For me personally, I know there are certain environments where there's only a certain Jason Cabinda I can be. I can present myself as. When I'm speaking to my owner, or I'm speaking to certain coaches, when I'm in certain rooms of financial directors or wherever I'm at, there are only certain aspects of me I can allow to come out, and there are only certain aspects of me I can be in order to be successful in those rooms, and in order to be looked at as being equal or looked at as being competent enough to have these conversations or on whatever they may be. Whereas I know I have teammates who come from different backgrounds, who may have grown up in the hood where they don't know how to be anything but that. And there's nothing wrong with how they are whatsoever, but it's how they are looked at by these people, and knowing that because they are how they are, it is assumed by these people that they can't survive in this environment, or they're not competent enough to be in this environment just because of the fact that they have different views, or they speak differently, or they act differently. And that's I think what Coach Frank was talking about when he said we're not there yet, in a sense that there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with wherever you may come from. If you have a knowledge about something, if you're able to do a task, you're simply able to do it. It's just this, there's left and right with that. And I think when he says we're not there yet, I think that's really what he's talking about. I think it's important that we do get there.
And if I could, I wanted to follow up with Coach Franklin. One of the things that you mentioned about being one of 14 African-American coaches, do you feel like in your role as a CEO that you have to speak up or speak to the people in power, speak to the presidents of these universities, and vocalize the need for having more Black coaches in these positions? Feel like you primarily lead by example? And then subsequently, if you do you feel like there's a level of why do I have to do this? Why do I have to be the person that has to stand up in that way?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of both. I think all of us as people of color, whether it's in college athletics or whether it's in college campuses or whatever it may be, I think we all carry a weight with that. So I think the first thing is I must be successful at Penn State because I know the success that we have is going to open the door for others. And I carry that weight every single day. We have one of the most diverse staffs in America, not just only with our coaches, but with our off the field coaches as well. But I also have a responsibility to talk to search firms about qualified African-American coaches that are out there. I have a responsibility to talk to college presidents that I'm familiar with. I also have a responsibility to talk to athletic directors. I have a strange career. 3 of the ADs that I've worked for in my career have either been Black or females, which is very unusual if you look at athletic directors in higher ed and college athletics. So I've been fortunate, but I think I have a responsibility to do both. I have to lead by example and show that someone that looks like us can be successful at the very highest level. I don't talk about this very much publicly, but my personal goal is to be the first African-American football coach to win a national championship. And that's for our players, and that's for Penn State. But I also understand what that will do for our community. I believe that. So I wake up every single morning with that weight that I have a responsibility to do this, but I also have a responsibility to be willing to have the conversations because I don't think we're going to reach our potential and get the opportunities that we need just by action. I don't think we're going to get it just by conversation. I think it's got to be both.
Yeah, and you know what? And that weight that you feel, the weight of that responsibility to ensure that others in your community are being uplifted and empowered and can see success is something that most of us can identify with. And I think, Sean, it is something that you do specifically at Youth Guidance with students here in the Chicago area, kind of uplifting them and exposing them to professionals of color who are successful in their industries. Can you talk more about that program?
Sure. And I don't want to make the assumption that all the people on this call know about the BAM program. So let me just give a high level sort of description of the BAM program. So at Youth Guidance in general and with BAM specifically, we provide school-based programming and support services to students. And the way we do that is through offering counseling services, through mentoring programs, through rites of passage programs, social emotional learning. And it's those particular areas, in addition to academic support and academic integrity, we do that around our 6 core values. And our 6 core values are related to integrity, accountability, self-determination, respect for womanhood, visionary goal setting, and then finally positive anger expression. And that last one, positive anger expression, I want to come back to that one because I want to tie that into the Black Lives Matter movement. But there are a couple of other pieces that I want to highlight as well. So first, we deal with students where they are. The students that we work with are primarily students of color that come from underserved and under-resourced communities. So the first thing is that we have to identify individuals who have strong youth engagement skills. You could have the greatest curriculum in the world, and we feel like we do have that at BAM. The BAM curriculum is 30 lessons, 15 lessons done the first year with students, another 15 lessons done that second year, the advanced curriculum, and then also we provide a curriculum around at work for those students who are going to leave directly from high school and subsequently go into the workforce. So we provide an at work curriculum. But you could have the greatest curriculum in the world. If you do not have an individual who can connect with students where they are, who can engage them and have those conversations and have that dialogue. BAM is a voluntary program. So all our students have to volunteer to participate in the BAM program. So that youth engagement point is critical, and being able to deal with students where they are, that's the first step in that process in terms of getting them involved and on that path in terms of their activation and participation within the BAM program. The second piece is around, again, the social emotional learning and mental health. So when we talk about social emotional learning, we're trying to get students to a point where they can express themselves and express their emotions in an appropriate way, whether that's in all different types of settings, whether that's at home, whether that's in a school environment, whether that's outside, whether that's in a professional setting. And so we work with them around that. And the main thing, one of the main points about social and emotional learning is about discovering that sense of becoming self-aware. One of the pieces that we do with BAM is that we do ruthless self-examination. And this is by us sitting in a circle, creating safe spaces for our youth to participate in that. Spaces where they can be angry, where they can be happy, where they can be themselves, where they can be vulnerable. And the big piece, and the big takeaway from that is that you start to identify with other students. So it's not a matter, many students feel like they're the only ones experiencing these things, they're the only ones who are feeling these emotions, but in actuality, they see that other students are going through the exact same thing. And so when they have that knowledge, then they start to feel very good about themselves. And when you have that sense of self, when you can appropriately express your emotions, then your mental health is in a very good place. And so that's how we focus in on that. The third piece I'd like to highlight about BAM is that we're data driven. And when I speak about data, I'm not talking about data just for the sole purpose of measuring your outcomes. We look at BAM in terms of utilizing data to create a narrative about this particular student. And so we want to create a picture of who this student is. What are their strengths? What are some areas where they have challenges? And because ultimately those areas lead to growth opportunities. And so the way in which we work with students, many people feel like, okay, if there's an area where you may have a challenge, we need to bring that up and make it a situation where this person is going to exceed in that level. That may not necessarily be realistic. So if we can uplift those challenging areas to baseline while focusing on their strengths and making that strength something of brilliance, now you have a child here who has a strength that is brilliant, and they can take that out and present that to the world. So again, those are the three areas in terms of what I wanted to focus in on BAM. And now I'd like to circle back to the positive anger expression piece. So what we look at when we look at BAM is that when people talk about and think of anger, they think of it as something to be controlled. As a matter of fact, there are classes that you can take. Everybody's heard of anger management classes, certifications, and things like that. But the thing is, anger is just an emotion, the same as happiness or sadness. You never heard of a happiness management class, have you? No. There's no such thing as a happiness management class. So when we look at that, we look at it from the standpoint of how can we help these children express themselves and identify what their triggers are. So when we talk about positive anger expression, anger is just energy, and it's going to come out in one of two ways. It can either come out through savage energy, or it could come out through warrior energy. And so that's what we try to make our children understand, help our children to understand, and subsequently make the conscious decision to engage in warrior energy. When we're talking about savage energy, that's destructive. Okay, you're going to see destruction. You're going to see it separate people. You're going to see situations where people become combative. Warrior energy is a situation where you build up. It brings people together. It connects people. And so that's what you have seen when we talk about what's going on in our country right now. With the atrocity that was the death of George Floyd, the death of Breonna Taylor, you have seen people respond. They have had a visceral impact as a result of that. So they have become angry. And what you have seen is that people have either gone in one of two directions. You see that there are plenty of examples of savage energy where you see rioting, where you see destruction of property, where you've seen looting, those types of things. But then there's also the warrior energy, and that ties in with the Black Lives Matter movement. People have taken that outrage and they have put that focus on being a part of the Black Lives Matter movement, which brings people together, which causes us to make sure that we challenge our people in leadership positions to make sure that they're looking out for the interests of people of color, specifically of African Americans, working to change the systemic approach in terms of dealing with systemic racism. So these are the ways in which the BAM program can tie into that. And I could talk about that all day, but I'd like to go back and let the moderator follow up with that.
Absolutely.
So Sean, I hear, there's a lot of programs that, youth guidance provides to empower, these Black youths in Chicago. Could you kind of tell me, what people mean when they talk about, defund the police, how important this is and how this connects to, community investment?
Sure. One of the things is that there's a lot of misinformation about defunding the police department. So when we're talking about defunding the police department, we're not necessarily talking about eliminating the police department. What we're looking at is looking at putting in and taking the budgets that these police departments have and then having them and diverting those funds into social programs in terms of community programs and things of that nature. So if a situation arises where there is a person who is having a mental health crisis, we put funds into the mental health community so then that person can be identified and then a person who is qualified to work with that individual can go out on a call to address the situation as opposed to a police officer who has not been trained in terms of dealing with the mental health community. So that's one aspect of it. Another way is that you can divert funds into community programs such as food pantries, programs that can provide living situations for individuals, and subsequently community centers so that we can have safe environments for our kids to play in where they can have safe and structured activities so that they're not in situations that could put them at harm's way in terms of being out there on the street. So these are just some of the ways in which we talk about defunding the police and how that process can take place.
I would also add, we could also go back and give the money back to the education system because we defund education year after year after year, and no one bats an eye. So defunding the police isn't actually all that radical because we do it in other areas of life. So we could put the resources back in the places we know work, which is one, the education system.
And thank you, Dr. Gaskins, for that. Another area that we can look at is funding programs around job procurement as well as workforce development. So again, when we talk about shortening or lessening the income gap that we have in this society, then we have to provide situations and systems where we can put our students and our young people in positions where they can have gainful employment. And so taking some money from the police budget and having that go into programs around workforce development and job procurement, that's a definite positive way in which we can do that.
So Jason, we hear, we learned about, youth guidance and all their efforts, to empower the Black people. What else can people be doing, around the community? How important is it for, people like you to use their platforms for this issue?
I think it's super important. I think when you ask, what can people do in terms of the community? I mean, there's scales to it. You want to go to a larger scale. You look at a guy like Colin Kaepernick, who's absolutely sacrificed his entire career for this movement and for bringing social justice to where it needs to be, to going into these police buildings and talking to police and talking about how to de-escalate situations and trying to bridge that gap, that gap in information on how we can understand each other and understand each other's cultures. You look at Saquon, you look at other athletes who are pouring money into their communities and giving back to give these kids, better outlooks, better opportunities. I think for me growing up, a really powerful moment for me it was actually the only day of school I ever missed. It was Obama's inauguration. And I think for me, seeing somebody like Obama, seeing a black person become president, I think not a lot of people talk about this or know about this, but as black people, we look at, okay, what's the best way we can have success? What's the best way to get money or get to wealth? And for a lot of black people, the only things that come to mind are being an entertainer, which is being a rapper or singer, being an athlete, or doing or dealing drugs. And you see a lot of people who put themselves in these situations, and a lot of times it's simply because of the fact that we don't grow up in a world where we see black people in these other positions, in these other areas of different industries in which they can have success. And nowadays we see more and more, the first black person to do this, first black person to do this. And until we see that, and until we see it in the media, I mean, even growing up in shows, a lot of the likenesses that we see in shows in the media that we grow up are all in white people's likenesses. So unless you see somebody who looks like you, and you can see somebody who you can relate to in those positions and having that type of success, it's hard to envision yourself having it as well. And then when you look at the smaller scales, somebody like me, I tweet a lot. If you look at my social media platforms on Instagram and Twitter, I tweet a lot about this stuff. I've been to the protests. I've done those kinds of things. I think even when I did those, I still felt like I wasn't doing enough. And a little initiative that I started, I started this little kind of IGTV series on my Instagram called, The Conversation That Needs to Be Had, in which I was basically inviting people of all different, passive lives, white, black, Asian, whatever, and basically creating a safe space and a safe environment in which these things can be discussed. And it didn't have to be in any hateful kind of manner or in a debating type of manner, but just in a way that was all about educating each other and being able to bridge this gap in cultures. Because I think a lot of the issues that here in America, Americans don't view black culture as American culture. And that's a huge problem, because I think to know black culture is knowing American culture. And until that really coincides and that comes together in people's heads to really understand that, I think it'll be a hard time to get over this hump. So doing everything that you can. And that goes to, being at your family barbecue and you have that uncle who makes racist jokes, or you have that uncle who makes inappropriate jokes, and correcting him then and there, because it's in those spaces where people feel that they're the most comfortable, where they can say whatever, or, whatever the case may be. It's starting there and making sure that there's no safe space for racism. There's no safe space for any of those types of sentiments to come out of anybody's mouths. And until we can reach that area where no matter where any kind of bigotry is spoken or it's out, there's pushback. I think we're seeing a lot of that pushback in these protests. We're seeing a lot of that pushback in the amount of activism. We're seeing young people stand up. I mean, and it's amazing. To some people, it's this craziness, but I think MLK is the one who said it, to be a conscious black man here in America is to be in a constant rage and constant anger, because you see it all the time. And it comes to a point where you have to filter and you have to turn it off. I mean, there's times where I got to get off Twitter. I can't look at that stuff anymore because I feel like I'm seeing another unarmed black man getting shot every other day or whatever the case may be. And I think that takes a mental toll on you. And so just continuing to do our best to bridge that gap in cultures, I think is the best thing. Supporting black-owned businesses, going out and signing petitions, all these things are helpful things. So it starts there.
Can I just follow up with something that Jason mentioned? One of the critical things at the grassroots level is exposure. So again, if you can't see it, then you can't envision it. And that's one of the things that we do with our BAM program, is that we try to expose our children to different situations, our youth to different situations. Within the Chicago area, it's a very segregated city. Chicago is an extremely segregated city. And so we have a lot of our students who they exist within a 5-block radius, and they haven't left those 5 blocks. So taking them to places like they've lived in Chicago, but they've never been downtown, and just exposing them to those different things, and then trying to mitigate the barriers that can be present. And I mentioned this before when we were talking. One of the programs that we have in place with the BAM program is the Chicago Police Department and the BAM basketball tournament. We have external partnerships with sports franchises, Chicago Fire, the Chicago White Sox, and the Chicago Bulls. And one of the things that we came up with was the Chicago Police Department and the BAM students engaging in the basketball tournament. So the teams were paired where the Chicago Police Department and the BAM kids, they were all on the same team, and it was a tournament. And the Chicago Bulls players were a part of that. And so they got to see that. They got to go to they got to go to the United Center and be a part of that, and just to meet them and experience that whole piece. But the bigger piece came from the fact that the police department, the Chicago Bulls players, they all sat in BAM circles. So the students were able to interact with them, hear their stories, see how they came up. So I come from the same communities that you came from. Even the police department, there are certain police officers come from the same communities that they come. Ask the tough questions like, okay, when you see a black man, what do you see? When you see a youth that looks like me, what are you thinking as a police officer when you interact with us? Why are we the ones who are getting jammed up? Those kinds of things. So the circle created a safe space where they could have the conversations and have those real conversations in terms of how that interaction takes place. And again, this is something that Chicago Bulls has continued to support around us. Jimmy Butler is an extremely big supporter of the BAM program. You will see him with his BAM shirt on even after he's left the city. So again, by building those relationships and exposing our youth to that, they start to see what possibilities are out there outside of that 5 or 6 block radius that they tend to exist in.
Hey, Sean, not to get off topic here, but I noticed you didn't mention the Chicago Bears. And I think part of these conversations are important because we build relationships. And I have contacts at the Chicago Bears. So when we get off this call, I want you to reach out with me because I'm going to try to get the Chicago Bears involved in your organization. And to me, that's the power of having conversations like this so that we can all become interconnected and support one another because we're not going to do it by ourselves. So please reach out to me and hopefully I can make a connection with the Chicago Bears.
And Coach, awesome. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to negate the Bears. We do have situations where the Bears players have come and sat in BAM circles with our guys. So again, thank you for bringing that up. But the Bears are also a part of our program as well.
Good, just making sure.
And I know where we are with time, but I just want to quickly mention, because Jason brings up this great idea of representation and the lack thereof, and Coach Franklin brought this up about the lack of representation in coaching, right? But what also Jason mentioned, and I don't want us to lose that either, is the self-care that he has to engage in to turn social media off sometimes, because some of this representation that we're seeing is the continuous murder of Black folks who are unarmed. And so there is an idea, a concept in psychology and mental health known as vicarious racism, which is just the idea that to feel the symptoms of PTSD and of trauma, you don't have to actually experience the specific event. You can just experience it by rewatching something. And so that routinely happens for Black folks. So I just appreciate, one, Jason talking about his engagement, but also the need to engage in self-care around that.
Absolutely. Wow. You all have provided so much insight. I hope our listeners have learned as much as we have ourselves, and we're members of the Black community, so I hope that tells you something. Just in our last moments here, to the panelists, just remembering that our listeners are coming in, again, with all levels of understanding and at different points along their journeys here. What are, let's say, 1 to 2 things that they should be keeping in mind as they embark on this journey, go out into the community, and really try to affect change for their Black and brown friends and colleagues?
I would tell them, oh, go ahead.
Please.
I was going to tell them to move past being performative when they talk about what it looks like. We don't need any more performative measures. We need real structural changes. And so really looking at the fragility and the guilt that you may feel when you talk about these issues, sit in that feeling, but then actually put plans in place. There's been a lot of performative measures happening in the wake of George Floyd's death, which, to be honest, aren't necessarily bad, but they're not fixing the problem either. And so we really need people to stop worrying about the optics of things and really put things into place so we don't have to have another conversation about a Black body and giving ourselves PTSD that Dr. Hurd talked about. It shouldn't take the death of a person for us to dismantle some of these systems.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I was going to mention is, the understanding of having conversations with people that don't look like us. I think, Jason, we understand in college athletics and sports, you have the ability to build relationships very close, meaningful relationships with people that don't look like you. And the reality is, one of the problems that we have with race in our country is too many smart, intelligent, articulate people have avoided the conversation for too long because it's been uncomfortable. So it's not just about us having these conversations, it's engaging people that know this is wrong, but have really just kind of stayed out of the conversation. We need to engage them and make sure that they understand how important they are in making a difference in our country and our communities.
I think for me, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I would say an ally's work is not for the meek of heart. That's something like I try to tell my students all the time. Ultimately, it's something that you should be doing, so you may not get credit for it, and you might not get the pat on the back that you hope to get, as well as you might put something at risk, like conflict with your family and friends, to have those difficult conversations. But still, I encourage everyone to push on. Consistency is important. And along the lines of what Dr. Gaskins said, and getting away from performative things and incorporating that with something that Coach Franklin said about, having the conversations, working on yourself is, while working on ourselves to become anti-racist is important, it's very important. The casualties of white supremacy don't have the privilege of waiting for individual progress, your individual progress, right? So simultaneously, while you're working on yourself, also work to challenge your families, friend groups, communities, and make impact on a systemic and structural level.
I think for me, I think just eliminating this stigma, the whole, shut up and dribble stigma, and the stigma that athletes shouldn't be able to speak on these things, because like Coach Franklin said, if there's a group of people who know more about putting their differences aside, no matter where they come from, what background, whatever views they may have, in order to work towards a common goal, it's athletes. So I think just eliminating that stigma that athletes shouldn't speak about, or people in sports, or don't make it political, or don't. If there's anybody who knows how to work together and get towards a common goal, it is athletes. So I think finding out what works in teams, what works in athletics, what works in sports that allows us to be able to do that, and maybe learning that and being able to incorporate it in modern day politics and incorporate it in the way that we work with each other outside of sports. So that's a stigma I really would like to get rid of.
And I guess for me, the theme would be, again, dealing with people where we're at. And when we're talking about the grassroots level and working with students, again, having programs that can have that profound impact on students. Because what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement is that you see so many young people that are involved in that process. They're the ones who are on the front lines and who are doing the work. So again, that next generation of these young people being in there and having those discussions with them. One of the things that we talk about with BAM is giving the gift of accountability. So again, holding people accountable is not a chore, it's not a task, it is a gift that you provide to people when you hold them accountable. So you have the unpleasant and the uncomfortable conversations. You challenge and confront around that. And challenging and confronting does not necessarily mean adversarial. That means that we're having an open and frank and honest discussions about areas where I feel uncomfortable, areas where I want to challenge you at, and call you on certain things that you have said. So I think if we can do that, that's the piece that I want to resonate with people and leave people with that.
Hey Keith, let me just add one last thing, if it's okay. Back to our conversation, that we had earlier, and I brought up the documentary 13th. As I mentioned, I had all the coaches in our athletic department as well as the administration watch it. And last week, one of the coaches told me that based on that interaction and based on watching that documentary, he had a really tough and challenging conversation with his parents, trying to get his parents to understand the Black Lives Matter movement. And to me, that meant the world to me, that here's someone that was willing to have a very difficult conversation with his parents from a very different generation, But to me, those are the things that we have to happen, like Jason talked about. It's your white friend that is at the family barbecue and the uncle or the grandfather says something and they say, I'm just going to let that go because that's Uncle so-and-so. Well, you can't. So, the more people that we can get to understand that, the better we'll all be. That was just something that is a personal, anecdote that I thought, really made me feel proud of maybe some of the changes that we're making in our community.
Wow. Well, thank you all so much to our listeners. We said it once, we'll say it again. We've only scratched the surface here. And so with all of this advice, we charge you to leverage the Google and the interwebs, your Netflix accounts, all these wonderful resources that you have available to you to learn more and continue the conversation and continue being active in this fight for racial equity and justice.
Yep. I wanted to say a last thanks to all the panelists for, participating in this conversation and providing, this inspiring wisdom to all our guests, who joined us from different parts of their journey. So very appreciated. Up next, we're going to have a 10-minute break, and then we're going to go into the guided workout. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Much appreciated. Have a good day.